sort of getting detached completely from the control of Paris. And what's now going to happen with that is also a very important and interesting story, because so now you have these 8 countries. Do we know what they want to do? They have signaled that they'd like to now go and join the ECO immediately. The ECO is not ready. There's no proper structure for setting up the ECO. So what are they going to do? Those that have been pushing and proponents of the status quo have been saying, like, look, just because the CFA franc, first of all, has some connection with Paris, right? We have stability in terms of the exchange rate. It's fixed to the euro. So we know our exchange. There's that financial stability in our economies. Also, because we have these other sort of governance structures, it helps to keep checks and balances. And the 8 of us have the same currency. It helps us to also check each other. So we have to ensure that there's stability of the CFA franc, as opposed to the other countries where one country's currency could keep fluctuating, as opposed to the neighbor's currency, or not relate to the neighbor's currency. What's going to happen now that we have this? Let's bring in somebody who understands these matters a bit better than us. This is Patrick Stephenson. He is an economic consultant and writes for the African Report. Good morning, Patrick.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for having me.
Good morning, Patrick.
Hi, good morning, Andrew. How are you?
Very well, thank you. If we start this conversation, I mean, it's got a lot of historical value when it comes to understanding what was really going on. But I mean, if we can just start rudimentarily now, where are we? What's going on? Because if we want to look at Africa as a whole and look at how it has been segmented over time, what does this mean now for the financial and economic independence of specifically these 8 countries?
Well, so it's interesting you take the narrative, back to what the history really has been. I mean, not only for these 8 countries we have within the sub-region, but at least the continent as a whole. At that famous Berlin conference on the continent was balkanized. We never thought there was ever going to be a day where we've seen some of the developments we're seeing now. So a part of me, will say yes. At least it's better than nothing. But if you look at the way the global economy is organized today, this is just another mechanism, in my view, and I know a lot of people probably would disagree with this, but it's just another way that metropolitan France is still finding, to control the economies of these 8 West African countries. And what is more, in my opinion, which is more damaging, is the possible impact that is likely going to have, not on those 8 economies, not on those 8 French economies, because as you're aware, there's a lot of conversation about, creating a common market for not only West Africa, but at least the African continent as a whole, which has implications for, things like what currencies we are going to have for conducting business, etc. And so the possible setback will not be for only these countries. And it looks like a mirage. So, on one hand, we're told, these countries no longer have to deposit, some parts of their foreign reserves. For the want of a better word, for those who may not be in this discipline, saying that whatever money that country has, these 8 countries, they don't have to go and deposit these monies, in metropolitan France anymore. It creates a perception that, well, then you get to keep all of the money that you have, and it makes your economy sound. That's not true. It's not necessarily the case. And it's not the case because of a number of factors. So if you permit me, I explain what these factors are.
Please do. Yeah.
There's what we call the conduct of monetary policy that is supposed to guide the behavior of government, how they spend money, and how they direct the economy. It happens in every country. So every country has got a central bank that works with the government to direct monetary policy, which influences the government's own fiscal policy and what they do. Now, ordinarily, the country that controls its own currency dictates its monetary policy. So for years now, the Francophone countries that were using the CFA franc, which is based on that colonial tax system, could not control their own monetary policy. Okay? And that was stemmed out of the fact that a greater percentage of their monetary policy reserves or their foreign currency reserve had to be kept in France. What you have now is not to say everything is all of a sudden going to be kept, in these 8 countries. That's the first thing that we got to recognize. Secondly, a part of that as well is the suggestion that they are going to anchor this to the euro. Well, none of these countries print the euro.
Yeah.
None of them.
None.
So effectively, the monetary policies of these countries is going to be dependent on developments you have in Europe and what happens to the euro.
Yeah.
So the sovereignty that you typically look for in a country like maybe Nigeria that controls its own naira and so has to deal with maybe FX exchanges with dollar and other currencies, they don't have that luxury for these 8 countries. What is worse, they may not be able to dictate their independent monetary policies. They are going to have to create a monetary union, like you may have for, in the case of West Africa, for example, we have these West African Development Bank. They may need a monetary institution. And already within ECOWAS, we have the West African Monetary Institute that is supposed to help set up a framework by which we conduct monetary policy within the region. We just haven't been able to actualize that properly. And so if we consider the fact that there is a possibility that monetary policies for these countries will not be dictated by them, then I ask, who really is determining the behavior of the governments of these countries instructing their economy?
Yeah.
If we don't get to the bottom of that, it's very problematic. And that's why I say this looks like it's fine, but it's a mirage. Why
So you still think that Paris will have a control over this, Patrick?
Well, it's not what I think. It is what their decisions suggest. That they effectively are going to conduct monetary policy in this way. That is going to determine what the governments are going to do. Like we've not even gotten into what the geopolitical structures around, the whole system that they are trying to put across looks like. Because again, we understand some power movements within the West African, the Waimu region that led to this happening. People not being comfortable about the position of Nigeria, for example, in ECOWAS, France seeing that they're gradually losing political ground, and so this is another way by which they could still get to control the system. And so we've not gotten into those debates, right? If we want to look at it purely on economic basis, and the argument that France somewhat is doing something good, I'm saying it's not. If you want to get out, just get out. That's it.
So
if you want to get out, get out.
Are these 8 countries positioned? I mean, just you talked about, economic institutions that are necessary for some kind of policy. Are these 8 countries, as they are, specifically positioned to be able to get out and stand alone? That's one side of the question. And then the part B of that question, Patrick, would be then that are they applauding this move as nations? Are they applauding this move and saying, finally, we are free? Against the backdrop of what you've just said, that it's a mirage and it's not really happening in terms of freedom.
Well, so those are very interesting and very important questions that you put across. First of all, are the countries solid enough? I mean, they are not the smallest of countries in the world.
No.
That's the point. That's a fact that I've got in. They may be small, they may be poor by some benchmarks, but they are not the smallest countries in the world. And for me, every country has got what it takes to organize its own economic affairs based on the size of its economy and if it decides to make those decisions. So if you take Benin, for example, yes, Benin may not look too big within the West African sub-region. Benin may not go and rub shoulders with Nigeria, for example. I mean, Nigeria closing its borders, some months ago because of the infiltration of arms, almost decimated some parts of the Benin economy.
Right.
So those economies may be small, but my point is that they have what it takes to survive because you have much smaller and much more complex economies elsewhere on the globe that haven't died simply because they are making decisions alone. That's one. Two, the countries live in a sub-region where they do business and trade. Right? So if you cut off the dependence on France and the export of minerals and the export of resources and transfer of resources into metropolitan France, European market, there's an opportunity here for the Beninois to do business with their brothers in Nigeria.
Right.
They cross the border anyway.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity here for the Togolese to cross the border and do business with their brothers in Ghana. If you go to Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, the same narrative exists. And so the point is that to the extent that we're saying we need to start looking inwards as Africans to start trading with ourselves, I believe there's an opportunity for these countries to stand on their own. That is the first point. Secondly, they have what it takes to conduct their independent monetary policy that determines what is going to happen in that part of the of the West African market.
Right.
What is interesting, though, is that all of these conversations are happening at a time where ECOWAS itself is thinking of a common currency. The African continent itself is thinking about a common trading area. So the prospects for standing alone and getting to do things on their own, in my opinion, really looks bright. The only challenge is that there is a mirage. It looks like we have given you freedom, we haven't given you. Which takes me to your second question. Is this necessarily a decision that the people of these countries are supporting? Well, I think there are two ways of examining that. One is to look at what the decision, what the feelings or the aspirations of the political class really looks like, and the connection or disconnection between the political class and their citizens. We know for years and decades that the citizens of these countries that you have outlined, these West African countries, have been displeased. They have not been happy with the way the economies have been managed and with the level of influence that France has had in these economies. We know that for a fact. And France, geopolitically, has continued to establish governments, they've supported governments that are dirigist, that have suppressed people over time. So, to some extent, there will be people who will think that this may be a step in the right direction. But when they look behind the cloak, when they lift the cloak and see that this is really not all good news, well, people are going to be worried.
Right.
However, the political class are playing to the gallery of France, so some of them can still stay in office. And we know Alassane Ouattara, for example, in Côte d'Ivoire, won.
Yes.
Right? And so the point is that some members of the political class, based on geopolitics and the pursuit of their own political interests, will be fine with the decisions that have been made. But I don't think the ordinary person walking the streets of Abidjan or the streets of Yamoussoukro or walking the streets of Togo and Benin really believe that this is something that has happened that is progressive enough and it's in the pursuit of their interest. If they get to understand what the details really looks like.
Right. We've had this conversation, even amongst countries who may not really suffer from domination, as it were, by an external force, right, Patrick? However, there are many issues that still, I mean, you started off by saying that not just these 8 West African countries, but countries across the continent who may be looking for some kind of independence. There have been talks. I mean, currently we're looking at the whole issue of acquisition of the African Development Bank and things like this, whereby people have been seeking for African solutions to African problems. And I hear you saying that these 8 and even others, apart from, what is happening with France, that this could be the solution that we're looking for as economically independent nations. The answers then are within. And for somebody who's studied the economies of African countries, do you feel that this is what needs to happen at this time?
Well, so there's a way of looking at it. In fact, there's a lot of extensive studies that have examined the preparedness of African countries to managing and running their affairs. And anytime we've tried to draw parity with colonialism and how, some of these countries have been oppressed, people are quick to point to a country like, Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, for example, right? And what you see there tells you that the repression that the continent of Africa and the various countries we have in there are confronted with is not a matter of black or white. It's not a matter of somebody crossing the Atlantic Ocean and suppressing and extorting resources from you. It's a matter of destroying institutions, political institutions and economic institutions that help people self-sustain, generate wealth and do business. So what we've had in Africa in the last 400 years, these political institutions and economic institutions by which people organize themselves were destroyed by white people that came and suppressed you. What we did in the 50s to the 60s was to replace the white tyranny, with black tyranny.
Right.
So we kicked the white man away, replaced them with tyrannical systems that are still exploitative politically and economically. So it is okay for an African government, an African political leader, to all of a sudden ransack a central bank, stash the money up in Europe somewhere. And that will not change the narrative. So are we at a point where Africans should be excited? Maybe yes, for feeling for the want of for feeling good to say that it is not the white man that is killing me, it's the black man.
It's one of our own.
For the want of a better word, that is silly.
It's silly.
Because again, the Greeks and I borrow the words of Greek philosophers here, where they argue that you cannot build any prosperous society when majority of the people are idiots. Idiots being people who typically are not bothered about what happens
About what's
them.
going on.
Okay?
Yeah.
Or people who are people who are tribalists who think that it's just about them and what matters. So that if there's a black man today walking the streets of Togo, walking the streets of Benin and feeling that, well, it is not the white man that is extorting me, it is my own people, it's fine. Well, there's everything wrong with that.
Right.
There's everything wrong with that. And the good old professor Patrick Otieno Lumumba, I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
Yeah.
I mean, he has consistently argued, he's an anti-corruption crusader, who tours the continent these days talking a lot about corruption. He argues that in Kenya, for example, he finds it strange when people say, "Oh, this thief is our thief."
Yeah.
It's okay, we know he steals from us, but we like him. That does not create a narrative where the African can move forward. So to answer your question more specifically, it is not okay to feel good that it is not the white man that is oppressing you economically or politically. I think that Africans have got to start asking questions about the extractive political and economic institutions that have governed them for so long. To get to a point where if the money, for example, from France is being returned, or like we have seen in the case of Nigeria, where Abacha's loot has been returned, if it's being returned, it's being returned to who?
Exactly.
Who benefits from the largesse? So that if you don't break down the extractive political institutions and build inclusive ones, if you don't destroy the extractive economic institutions and build inclusive ones, if you don't create systems that encourage young people that we have on our continent today to be very entrepreneurial and aspirational enough, then it makes no difference to say, you have the French are now giving you some level of sovereignty because people are going to extort you. You've seen examples of this in South Africa, for example, where apartheid is gone, but you still have extractive political institutions that are usurping people's lands and people don't have an opportunity to get economic freedom.
Right.
We saw that in Zimbabwe as well. We saw that in Zambia. So all across the continent, you have this checkered history that shows that replacing the color of the human being or whoever is oppressing you necessarily does not solve the problem. It is the ability of that society to break down the extractive political and economic institutions.
As I hear you speak, Patrick, it sounds to me that you're very much convinced that the African people have not reached that point where they are able to discern and tell that they are still living under oppression.
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it. I wouldn't want to say they haven't gotten to that level of consciousness. I think that if we borrow once again, the thinking of the Greeks when they argue that you don't want to build any society by looking at idiots or giving consideration to people who are tribalists. You want to really look at citizens who are bothered about things that happen to them, what happens to their neighbor, what happens to society as a whole. I think that consciousness is not there yet. Because of the extractive political institutions we've had, people don't believe, or people generally don't feel that they are part of the system, and that system needs to be fixed.
Right.
Okay. But if I should take a cue from what happened about a decade ago across the northern part of the continent, and some of the countries you have, towards the southern part, it gives me hope that it's possible that when people are displeased by the extractive political institutions, they can overthrow them. And I'm not saying people should go and pick up a gun and go shoot anybody. I'm saying that if the system by which you are governed politically and economically does not make sense, you have every right to find the right systems and mechanisms to overthrow them. And we've seen examples of that in Tunisia, we've seen examples of that in Egypt, we've seen examples of that in Zimbabwe, for example. It's a possibility. So I won't say the ordinary African or the young African today does not recognize it. They do. The question is, how do you then leverage the resources that you have? How do you leverage your own strength to overthrow these systems? And sometimes it's a matter of bread and butter. It's hard to navigate these constraints, these political constraints. So we will get there eventually. But I think that having a conversation like this, for example, for starters, is good.
Yeah.
And getting young people to understand that there has to be a change in the narrative.
But then I still want to dwell on that, Patrick. We still don't have that much consciousness within the continent to get us to understand that, well, we need to still change the system. If we look at the generations since the 50s to now, and the generations in the 50s that were now pushing and agitating for freedom and independence from the white man, why is it that we'd assume that those other generations since then haven't gotten to a point where they feel, well, we still are not living the ideals of what our forefathers were fighting for?
Well, so the answer to that question is two level. One, I think there's been a thinking across the continent of Africa that somehow the future of the continent has got to be orchestrated by 70-year-old men. I don't have anything against people who are 50, 60, and 70, but I'm sorry, that time is over.
Right.
I don't think 60 and 70-year-olds orchestrated the independence of Africa.
Yeah.
Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Emery Lumumba, Nelson Mandela, and the likes, who touched and saw what Africa needed to do or what Africa needed to look like. When 70-year-olds, when they were doing that, we're talking about people who were 27, 30, 33, 35-year-olds. There were 70-year-olds in their time who wanted to do things slow. They told them, no, it is now and it must happen now. What we saw after their time was the thinking that somehow they had to be the same people that orchestrated the future of Africa. And I think that's where the problem is. So I wouldn't want to say that the young African man today does not see. I think they see. But the systems are so extractive such that there's not even enough room. I mean, look at some of the countries you have on the continent where even political participation at a certain level has got to be about 40 or 50 years old. It doesn't make any sense. Okay? Yet, the very energetic part of that economy is usually people who are 30, 25, 27, 30-year-olds. I wonder if there's any 70-year-old on the African continent today who has a business and will employ another 70-year-old man to run that business for him.
Right. Definitely. I mean, you're going to look younger.
Right? Paul Biya won't do that.
Yep.
Muhammadu Buhari in Nigeria won't do that. None of them. What it tells you is that the engine and the energy for doing things that matter in the economy is all sitting within the age bracket that matters. However, for some strange reason, when we look at making the decisions that actually direct what the future looks like, somehow it has to be based on the experience of 70-year-old men. I'm sorry. And so to respond more specifically to the question, I'm saying that the young men on the African continent today, when you think of it in terms of leadership, what must happen on the economy, in terms of their consciousness and understanding what the world looks like, the world is more connected today than it was 50, 60 years ago. They don't need shit to go to Europe and find out that things are good. They don't need to fly out to go and find out that you can build a bridge that actually works and generates power. They don't need to do that.
No.
So people are a lot more enlightened and a lot more connected now. The only challenge is with the 70-year-olds relinquishing power and allowing young people to do things in a way that connects and works better. And that has been based off of the thinking that somehow you have to work in the private sector, grow, become 70-year-olds, get into the public sector, where the decision making, in my opinion, is more complex. It's more complex, more stressful. We put them there.
Right.
I think if we start changing that, we stand a better chance of usurping the energies that we need from young people to do things that matter on the African continent.
On the African continent. Okay, if we take a last question for you, Patrick, and that's like, I mean, hearing all that you've said and then just looking at the recent developments that are happening, even, with what was our subject matter, and obviously this can pass on to the entire continent. Do we have enough then in terms of information, in terms of drive, in terms of awareness of what needs to happen to make these changes on the continent, and to be able to look beyond, this, what I'll now adopt your word, this mirage that we may see of something that is representing something else? Do we have the wherewithal to look beyond that and actually then make these decisions that are necessary to move forward, whether it's economic development, whether it's authentic leadership and governance, whether it's proper policy making, whatever it is across country? Do we have enough?
Well, I don't think there's ever a time where there's been any economic agents, whether an individual, business, or government, has got all the resources they need, or had all the information they need to make decisions. I think the most important thing is that you recognize where you are and start from somewhere. And so, for me, the interesting thing on the African continent today, even if we should start off from the conversation we picked up of, which is what France is doing now, is a starting point. But people have to know what the truth is, which is why some of us get excited when, the likes of Chiombori, for example, came out vociferous to speak that somebody has got to tell the truth. For a very long time, the system by which things were done is very close, and a lot of the African countries today are still pretty close. The only thing we have perfected is how we change who runs the system of governance in Africa.
Right.
That's what the countries have figured out. My own country, Ghana, as an example, we have perfected it. In the last 30 years, we have decided we won't change government by the barrel of the gun. But what really inclusive policy making looks like, how open the system is for young people to participate, is usually not there. I'm not saying it's completely bad. It's a starting point. Okay, so we won't have all the pieces fall in place before we can make decisions or take action. But recognizing that this is the time to start making the action, in my opinion, is the most important thing. And all across the continent today, in every single country, these energies are aligning, people are connecting, and that is going to make things happen. So we start from somewhere. And I think the most important thing I'll say to end is that the media has got a very big responsibility in all of this. Right? So the conversation we're having, for example, is a part of it. There should be a young person listening to us today to understand that, this is probably all not the way it looks like.
Right.
There's a way for us to look better and try to understand the countries that we're coming from. And the most dangerous thing we will do will not be to educate the young people who are coming up to know the history and understand how they can then use that to inform decisions, in my opinion, particularly around policy making for the future. So we start from somewhere, educate ourselves, educate the people that we are with, educate the younger ones that are coming up, to recognize that all is not lost. Start from somewhere, you're going to make progress.
Absolutely.